The lake was quiet that morning, the kind of silence that comes only when the world is still asleep and not yet ready to remember its grief. Mist clung to the surface like breath on glass, curling and fading as the sun inched its way through the clouds. I sat at the edge of the old wooden pier, legs hanging loose, boots off, toes brushing the chill of the water. It had been years since I came here, and even longer since I'd let myself feel anything in this place. There's something about water that reflects not just your face, but your memories too, distorted, fleeting, and deep. Beside me sat my grandson, Jacob. 16 years old and already asking the kind of questions boys shouldn't have to ask. His eyes, too wide for his face, carried the weight of a world he hadn't lived through yet. I'd seen eyes like that before, back in the sand, in trenches, behind walls, looking at me just before someone stopped breathing. But Jacob's eyes weren't clouded by fear or blood. Not yet. They were full of something worse, curiosity. The kind that digs at scars and doesn't understand why they bleed. "Grandpa," he asked, breaking the quiet like a rock into still water, "do you ever miss being a soldier?" I didn't answer at first. Not because I didn't have one, but because I had too many. It's strange, the way a simple question can shake loose 1,000 moments you thought you buried for good. I looked at him, saw the innocence still clinging to his face like dew. And I realized I had two choices: lie and protect that innocence a little longer, or tell him the truth and let it go. So I took a deep breath, the kind you take before a dive, when you don't know how deep the water goes, and said, quietly, "Let me ask you something first." He looked at me, puzzled. "What if I told you," I paused, watching a pair of dragonflies skim across the lake, "that only the dead have seen the end of war?" His brow creased. "What does that mean?" I didn't expect him to understand, not really. I didn't understand it myself when I first heard it, back when I still believed that wars had endings and that medals meant something. I turned my gaze back to the water, watching it ripple around my feet, and I felt the pull of memory, heavy and relentless. I hadn't spoken of this in years, not to my wife, not to my friends, not even to God. But something in Jacob's question loosened the lock I had kept tight for too long. The kind of lock you think keeps the past out, until one day it starts to keep you in. "It means," I began, slowly, as if saying it too fast might summon the ghosts, "that war doesn't end when the fighting stops. It doesn't end when peace is signed on paper. It doesn't even end when you come home." Jacob's eyes widened a little, and I could tell he was listening with the kind of focus only youth can bring. "Then, when does it end?" I closed my eyes. Images surged like waves, sand sticking to blood, the hollow thud of mortar fire, the scream of a man realizing he's dying too slowly. I swallowed hard. "It doesn't," I said. "Not for those who survive it. It ends only for the ones who don't come back. The ones who never have to remember or live with what they've done. That's what I mean when I say only the dead have seen the end of war." The mist was beginning to lift now, and the sun caught the water just right, casting our reflections in jagged, rippling shapes. Mine looked older than I remembered. Tired. Like something carved out of stone and left to weather in the rain. Jacob was quiet for a long time. I could feel the question still turning over in his mind, like a coin in a gambler's palm. He was trying to understand, trying to find a place for my words inside a world that hadn't yet betrayed him. Finally, I said, "I didn't always believe that. I used to think I'd come back from the war and leave it behind, like a uniform I could hang in the closet. But it followed me. In my sleep. In the way I flinched at sudden noises. In the way I looked at people and wondered how many of them could have pulled a trigger if the moment had called for it. I looked at him then, not at the boy, but at the man he might become. And I knew I had to keep talking. He needed to hear the truth. Not the kind they write in history books or wrap in flags, but the kind that bleeds. "Let me tell you a story," I said, voice just above a whisper, the one I never told anyone. The one I thought I'd take to my grave. And with that, the dam broke. The past rushed in. And I was back there again, 19 years old, marching into a heat that felt like hell, clutching a rifle like it could save my soul. It was the spring of 1983 when I left everything I knew behind and stepped into the mouth of something I didn't yet understand. I was 19. Too young to drink, too young to vote in some places, but somehow just the right age to be handed a weapon and told to defend something vague: freedom, order, peace, pick your favorite lie. They gave me a uniform that didn't quite fit, boots that blistered my feet raw, and a rifle that felt heavier than the burden it represented. I remember the way my mother's hands trembled when she buttoned up my shirt the morning I shipped out, and how she tried not to cry. She failed. My father didn't say much, just gave me a stiff nod and a look I'd later understand as helpless pride. They sent us into a conflict that didn't make the headlines. We were told it was a peacekeeping operation. That phrase sounded clean, almost noble. But once our boots hit the ground, it took all of a day to realize that peace had packed up and left a long time ago. The land was scorched, the sky a dull orange that seemed perpetually on fire. Dust blew in from every direction, stinging our eyes and coating our skin until we felt like clay statues, slowly disintegrating under the sun. It didn't take long for the illusion of purpose to crack. You can't keep peace where none exists. You can only survive. Jenkins was the first one I lost. He was from Iowa, blonde hair, soft-spoken, used to be a church organist before all this. He had this nervous laugh, like he didn't believe his own jokes but still wanted you to smile. The desert didn't kill him with bullets or bombs. It killed him with thirst. We had marched too long under a heat that felt biblical. Our water reserves were rationed to a point where you had to choose between sipping and surviving. Jenkins had a faulty cap on his canteen, leaked just enough that by midday, he had nothing left. He kept pushing forward, didn't want to complain. That's how it goes. No one wants to be the first to say, "I'm breaking." Not in a unit full of boys pretending to be steel. He collapsed just outside the ridge where we were ordered to hold position. His lips were cracked open, bleeding at the edges. His eyes rolled back. We tried pouring what little we had into his mouth, but it was too late. He died looking at the sky, mouthing something I couldn't hear, maybe a prayer, maybe a memory. I remember how his body twitched a little before going still. No final words. No slow fade. Just stopped. That was my first death. The one I watched up close. It didn't look like it does in the movies. There was no swelling music, no dramatic speech. Just a boy with sand on his face and silence in his chest. We covered him with a tarp. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of guilt. I hadn't known him long enough to grieve the way people think you're supposed to. No, it was something else. A realization that we could die here without ever firing a shot. That the enemy wasn't just hiding behind hills or ruins, it was the land itself. The sun. The thirst. The waiting. It was then I began to understand that war doesn't start with bullets or bombs. War starts with forgetting. Forgetting the cost of peace. Forgetting what we trade for the illusion of security. Back home, people would watch clips on TV, neat, edited segments that framed us as the good guys, the brave ones. They never saw the boy we buried in a shallow ditch because we couldn't carry his body back. They never heard the whisper that passed between us afterward: if Jenkins can die from nothing, so can we. And that thought, that slow rod of hope, is how war truly begins. Not with a declaration, but with the silence that follows your first death. From that day forward, everything changed. We stopped thinking about going home. We stopped counting the days. You don't count when you're not sure the next sunrise is for you. We became ghosts in our own minds, half alive, drifting through orders and patrols like sleepwalkers. The only thing sharper than the edge of our bayonets was the slow carving of reality into our bones. Jenkins never held a weapon in combat. He never saw the enemy. He never fired a single shot. Yet he was the first casualty in my war. And for me, that was the moment I stopped being a recruit and became something else. Something hollowed out. I didn't become a soldier when I finished training. I became a soldier the moment I learned that in war, you don't die with purpose. You die with your eyes wide open, staring into nothing. That's when I started to feel it. Not fear, not grief, but a quiet, gnawing understanding. This wasn't about winning. This was about enduring. And not everyone would. We never truly knew who or what we were fighting against in the way most people imagine war. There was no marching army lined up with flags waving and clear battle cries echoing across the sand. The enemy wasn't an organized force that you could see, face, or predict. Instead, it was something far more elusive, almost intangible, a presence that slipped through the heat waves and dust like smoke, striking without warning and disappearing before you could react. They were called ghosts because that was exactly what they seemed to be, shadows flickering at the edges of your vision, whispers carried by the desert wind, figures you could almost believe were illusions conjured by exhaustion and fear. In those first weeks, we tried to make sense of who these ghosts were. Were they rebels fighting for their homeland? Bandits driven by desperation? Or simply people caught in a conflict that didn't care about right or wrong? It was hard to tell. The truth was often buried beneath layers of pain and propaganda, and the desert itself seemed to swallow everything whole. The wind didn't just carry sand, it carried unease, suspicion, and the weight of invisible eyes watching our every move. Every noise was suspect, a twig snapping, a distant shout, the faintest shift in the dust. We learned quickly that the worst battles weren't fought with bullets or bayonets. They were fought inside your mind, in the relentless anticipation of an attack that might come at any second, or never come at all. One moment seared itself into my memory more vividly than any other, the day I saw a child soldier for the first time. He was no older than 10, his frame so small that his arms barely reached around the worn rifle he clutched. His eyes were wide and wild, holding a strange mix of fear, defiance, and something I can only describe as a hardened resignation that no child should ever carry. For a fleeting second, my body froze, torn between the impulse to protect this boy and the brutal reality that he was armed and potentially deadly. My sergeant, however, did not hesitate. With a single shot, the child fell. Watching him collapse like a broken puppet was like watching innocence shatter into dust. That moment broke something inside me. It wasn't just the killing of a child, that was already an unbearable thought, it was what it revealed about war itself. War doesn't care about morality, about innocence, or about right and wrong. It doesn't pause to consider who you were before the fight began. It only cares that you survive, and sometimes surviving means becoming the monster you feared most. That day, the fragile boundary between enemy and victim, between right and wrong, was erased in the scorching desert sun. The enemy was not only the human ghosts who struck from shadows, the land itself was a merciless adversary. The desert was unforgiving, its relentless heat a slow-burning weapon that sucked the strength from our bodies and minds. Minds buried beneath loose sand waited silently for feet to wander too close, while snipers used the shimmering heat waves to cloak their deadly shots. The very ground beneath us was rigged with death, and every step could be the last. Moving through the desert felt like walking through a nightmare made of silence and sand, where the smallest mistake meant a violent, sudden end. I remember Daniels, a squad mate with a laugh that could cut through the bleakness like sunlight. He was the kind of man who made jokes in the worst moments because laughter was a defense, a way to claim some small piece of humanity. One afternoon, while we huddled in a dry riverbed, a sniper's bullet shattered the moment. Daniels dropped, blood blooming across his chest, the laughter gone in an instant. There was no time to react, no way to stop it. The weight of his death crashed down on us like a physical blow. It wasn't just losing a friend, it was the cruel reminder that death could arrive without warning, without reason, and that you were never truly safe. That's when the real battle started, not on the scorched earth or in the dusty hills, but inside my own mind. The war within me was relentless, a conflict between the instinct to survive and the crushing guilt of what survival required. How does a man hold on to his humanity when every choice demands he cast it aside? Every night, the faces of the dead haunted me, the child soldier, Jenkins, Daniels, Marcus, each one a reminder that the war was not something behind me but something living inside me. It grew in the silence, fed on my nightmares, and waited for moments when my resolve faltered. The enemy was not just the men who fired at us from the dunes. The enemy was the war itself, the fear that eroded our courage, the guilt that shattered our peace, the memories that refused to fade. It tore through us like wildfire, burning away our hope and leaving only ash. The uniform didn't make you a soldier, the war did. It carved scars deeper than any bullet hole, scars that no one saw but that never healed. Sometimes I wondered if I was even the same man who had arrived in that desert months ago. The war had transformed me into something else, a creature of shadows and silence, forever watching, forever waiting. The true enemy wore no face, but it lived inside every breath, every heartbeat, every flicker of fear that made me flinch at the sound of a car backfiring or the slam of a door. The desert was a cruel teacher, but the hardest lessons were the ones it whispered inside my mind long after the fighting stopped. War never gave me a clear enemy to hate. Instead, it handed me a mirror and forced me to stare into it, to confront the darkness inside myself. The ghosts I feared were not just those lurking in the sand, they were the pieces of my own soul I lost each day I survived. And in the end, I realized the war was not a chapter in my life, but a wound that would never fully close, a shadow that would follow me wherever I went. Letters. I wrote them every week, sometimes twice a week, filling page after page with words that I hoped would reach Anna's hands in her heart, but never mailed a single one. The envelopes piled up in a small, battered box tucked beneath my cot, each one a fragile vessel carrying my unspoken fears, hopes, and regrets. Anna, the girl I loved before the war took me, was my lifeline, my tether to a world that still held light and laughter. She was the soft glow in the endless dark I was plunged into, the memory of home that sustained me through days that blurred into nights filled with nightmares. Every letter I wrote was an attempt to hold on to that man I once was, the boy who dreamed of college, of music and books, of a future painted in simple joys, before the desert and the blood reshaped me into something unrecognizable. I remember one night especially, sitting in our cramped, mosquito-netted tent with a flickering lantern casting trembling shadows on the canvas walls. The air was thick with the acrid smell of sweat, gun oil, and dust that seemed to settle into every pore. My fingers were stiff and raw from the cold desert nights and the rough edges of the paper, but I kept writing, desperate to breathe life into words that might one day make it back to her. I tried to describe the unrelenting sun that burned the horizon into a searing blur of reds and oranges, the endless expanse of sand that swallowed us whole, and the way the heat sucked the moisture from my throat until swallowing became a painful effort. I wrote of Jenkins, his boyish grin that had faded under the weight of exhaustion and thirst, and of the silence that followed his collapse, how the desert had claimed him without a shot being fired. I attempted to convey the tension that pressed down on our chests like an invisible weight, the ever-present fear lurking behind every shadow, every sudden movement. But no matter how carefully I chose my words, the truth was jagged and raw beneath the surface. I could not mask the horror of witnessing a grenade explode so close that the blast shook me to my core, nor the silence that swallowed the screams and echoed long after the smoke cleared. I confessed in those letters the faces that haunted my every night, the open eyes of the men who had fallen beside me, staring into nothing, as if searching for something beyond this life. I told her of the weight of carrying the dead, the smell of burning flesh, and the endless questions without answers. And yet, I painted it all with a gentleness that belied the brutality I had come to know, because I wanted her to hold on to the hope that I was still safe, still me. Then came the moments when the truth clawed through the veneer. I wrote about the man I had become, a soldier hardened by loss, living in the shadow of a boy who no longer seemed to exist. I tried to put into words the hollow ache of waking every day with the ghosts of comrades whispering in my ears and the guilt that gnawed relentlessly at my soul. But each time the truth spilled too freely onto the page, I paused, trembling. How could I burden Anna with this reality? How could I let her see the nightmare that had become my life? The words felt like knives that could wound her innocence, sever the fragile connection between us. So, more often than not, I tore those letters into jagged pieces, crumpled them in my fists, and cast them into the fire or the bottom of the box, hoping the flames or the darkness would consume the pain they carried. Those letters became a secret I guarded fiercely, a silent rebellion against the war's attempt to erase me. They were the man I wanted to be speaking across the miles, the man who still believed in love and peace, even as the world I lived in turned to chaos. Each unsent letter was a lifeline thrown toward a shore I feared I would never reach, a desperate plea to hold on to a past slipping further away with every passing day. Yet silence, I learned, can be a heavy burden. The weight of those unsent words pressed on me, like an anchor pulling me under. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, when the camp was quiet and the desert stretched endlessly beyond the tents, I would take out a letter and read it by the flickering lantern light. The sound of my own voice, the shape of my handwriting, the raw honesty of the pages would bring a strange comfort, only to reopen old wounds and stir memories I tried so hard to bury. The more I read, the clearer it became that the war was not just out there in the sand and gunfire. It was inside me, in the unsaid words, in the broken promises to Anna, and in the hollow spaces between the lines. I realized some stories are never meant to be told. Some truths are too heavy to carry, even in ink and paper. The letters I wrote but never sent were my confession, my cry for help, my silent scream into the void. They were the pieces of my shattered self, scattered across countless pages, waiting for someone, anyone, to understand. But I was too afraid of what they might reveal, not only to Anna but to myself. To read those letters was to confront the man I had lost and the man I had become, and that was a confrontation I was not ready to face. In the end, those letters remained locked away, hidden beneath my cot like fragile ghosts of a life left behind. They were a testament to the boy I used to be, and a haunting reminder of the war that stole him away, one word, one unsent letter, one shattered dream at a time. One of the nights that etched itself most deeply into my memory, the kind of night that haunts you long after the war has faded into distant echoes, was the night of the river crossing. It wasn't just another operation, it was a moment that stretched time, distorted reality, and pressed down on every ounce of my being with unbearable weight. We were ordered to cross a narrow, shallow river under the cover of darkness, to launch an ambush on an enemy outpost we had been tracking for weeks. The mission seemed straightforward on paper: move silently, strike swiftly, and vanish before the first light of dawn. But war has a way of stripping away all simplicity, leaving only chaos and raw survival. The river, in the moonlight, seemed almost peaceful, its surface shimmering faintly, casting ghostly reflections that danced with the breeze. I remember stepping into the cold water, how the chill stabbed through the exhaustion and heat that had baked us all day. The cold was a shock, making my muscles clench and my breath hitch, the muddy riverbed squelching beneath my boots. I followed the line of soldiers ahead of me, each step cautious, every movement deliberate. The silence was thick, almost tangible, broken only by the faint splash of boots and the soft rustle of gear. Every noise felt amplified in the stillness, the whisper of fabric, the ragged breathing of men straining to keep calm despite the fear coiling tight inside us. Then, halfway across, everything unraveled. A sudden, piercing cry shattered the fragile quiet, a woman's voice, raw with desperation and fear. The sound was so out of place it was jarring, as if a scream had torn through the fabric of night itself. Someone had triggered a hidden tripwire, and the tension snapped like a brittle thread. My heart slammed against my ribs, pounding so fiercely I thought it would betray our position to the enemy. Then came the explosion, a thunderous blast that hurled dirt, water, and debris into the air, knocking two men beside me off their feet. The riverbank transformed into a maelstrom of chaos, screams mingling with the acrid sting of gunpowder and the coppery smell of blood. The cold water around us churned with mud and panic. The ambush we planned became a nightmare in an instant. Amid the confusion, I caught sight of a woman standing near the riverbank, a local, unmistakably. Her clothes were torn, her face pale, and her eyes wide with terror. She spoke in broken, hurried words, pleading with us to stop, warning us of traps we hadn't anticipated and dangers lurking in the shadows. She was no soldier. She was a frightened civilian caught in the middle of a war that didn't care who lived or died. In that instant, something inside me wanted to listen, to believe her, to pause the madness. But the panic took over. Fear overwhelmed reason. We fired before thinking, before truly seeing her, and the crack of the gunshot rang out sharp and final. The woman collapsed, a single bullet cutting through the chaos and ending her plea. Her scream faded into the night like a ghost lost in the wind, her body crumpling to the dirt beneath her. In that moment, the cold realization settled deep in my bones. We had killed one of the very people we were meant to protect. The war had robbed us of clarity, turning protectors into executioners in a blink. I stood there, soaked and trembling, staring down at her lifeless form, and felt a darkness like no other settle over me. The war wasn't just a distant battle anymore, it was a brutal erosion of morality and humanity. The clear lines between right and wrong, friend and foe, blurred into meaningless shadows under that moonlit sky. I felt the walls I had built around my heart crack and crumble, leaving raw, bleeding edges exposed to the night's cold embrace. That river crossing stayed with me for years afterward, a scar not just on my memory but etched into my conscience. The physical wounds from that night healed, but the emotional ones festered, invisible to the world yet impossible to ignore. It became a symbol of everything I despised about war, the way it breeds confusion, mistrust, and tragic mistakes that haunt you long after the fighting ends. The woman's warning was drowned out by the chaos and fear, her life snuffed out before she could make us understand. Her death was one more voice lost in the endless, relentless noise of a conflict that seemed never to end. War does not discriminate. It kills the innocent as easily as the guilty. It tears apart communities, families, and souls with equal cruelty. It teaches you harsh lessons, that sometimes the enemy is not just the one who aims a weapon at you, but also the chaos and fear within your own ranks. It shows you how quickly trust can shatter, how easily hesitation can turn into tragedy. And in those moments, the greatest danger is not the sniper in the distance, but the bullets fired in confusion and panic. As I carried that night with me through the years, I realized that some wounds refuse to heal. They live deep inside, heavy as stones in your chest, a burden that no medal or commendation can ever lift. The river crossing was not just a battle, it was a reckoning. A brutal, unforgiving lesson in the cost of war, the fragility of humanity, and the terrible price of survival. And even now, decades later, when the world feels calm and safe, I can still hear that woman's cry echoing in the silence, an eternal reminder that in war, there are no clean victories, only shattered lives and endless sorrow. After the river crossing and the unbearable weight of that night, the days that followed seemed to stretch into an endless haze, like wandering through a landscape blurred by exhaustion and grief. The war moved forward without pause, demanding our attention with ruthless efficiency. There was no room for mourning, no moment spared to honor those lost or to heal the wounds carved deep into our souls. Orders came down relentlessly, missions stacked one on top of another, and the desert heat beat down like a merciless drum. But inside me, something had irrevocably broken. The woman's face, the wide, terrified eyes, the pleading hands, haunted every waking moment, replaying over and over with the cruel clarity of a nightmare I could not escape. The guilt wrapped itself around my heart like a shroud, thick and suffocating, clouding every thought and choking the breath from my chest. In the rare quiet moments between firefights and patrols, when the harsh clamor of war briefly receded and the camp settled into an uneasy stillness, I found myself slipping away from the others. I sought solitude in the vast, empty spaces at the edge of our camp where the desert stretched out in barren silence, broken only by the whispering wind and the occasional lonely cry of a distant bird. There, away from the forced camaraderie and the constant noise, I let the memories flood in, screams tearing through the night, the acrid stench of gunpowder and blood, the choking dust that clung to my throat and lungs. I would close my eyes and reach out for the life I once had, but it was like trying to grasp something through water, distorted, unreachable, and slipping further away with each desperate grasp. The change did not go unnoticed. My comrade saw the light fading in my eyes, the laughter vanishing from my lips. I was no longer the soldier who had marched into the desert with determination and youthful certainty. I had become a ghost, moving silently among the living, hollowed out by what I had seen and done. My sergeant, a grizzled man hardened by his own battles, pulled me aside one evening after roll call. His face was etched with concern, and without a word of judgment, he placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "Hold on," he said simply. Those two words echoed in my mind like a lifeline, but in the depths of my despair, they felt like an impossible command. How could I hold on when everything inside me was unraveling? Sleep became a battleground of its own. The nights were plagued by vivid nightmares, reliving the river explosion, the woman's scream that still echoed like a death knell, the vacant eyes of Jenkins staring at nothing. I would wake gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as if it were trying to escape the cage of my ribs. In the darkness, I whispered apologies, soft, broken words of regret and sorrow, to those I could not save, prayers for forgiveness that seemed to fall into a void. These silent confessions were my only solace and my cruelest torment. The exhaustion from sleepless nights bled into my waking hours, dulling my focus and sapping my strength. I was a hollow shell, going through the motions, trapped in a war not just on the battlefield, but inside my very mind. In the midst of this personal hell, I searched desperately for meaning, for a thread of purpose in the chaos. I observed my fellow soldiers, their bravery, their fractures, their moments of quiet kindness hidden beneath layers of grit and pain. Each of us carried invisible wounds, though some masked theirs with jokes and bravado, while others wrapped themselves in silence. But beneath it all was a shared truth: war changes you. It strips away illusions of glory and honor, leaving raw, exposed nerves that throb with pain and fear. We were no longer just men fighting a foreign enemy. We were broken souls fighting to remain human. One afternoon, exhausted and hollow, I found myself sitting by the remains of a long-dead fire pit. The charred stones were blackened and cracked, a silent testament to past nights spent trying to find warmth and camaraderie in the cold desert. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small photograph I had carried with me, a faded image of Anna, her face bright with a gentle smile, sunlight catching her hair as she held a book in a field far from this desolation. For a fleeting moment, the harsh desert faded away, replaced by the softness of that memory. I traced the edges of the photo with trembling fingers, yearning to send her a message, a sign that I was still alive, still fighting, not just the enemy, but the darkness that threatened to consume me from within. But the war had changed me in ways words could not capture, in ways I feared would drive her away. The boy in that photo and the soldier I had become were separated by a chasm filled with loss, fear, and violence. I no longer knew which version of myself would survive this hell, or if either would return whole. In those long, lonely hours, I learned that survival was about more than bullets or battlefield tactics. It was about holding on to fragments of hope and clinging to what little humanity remained. It was about finding strength in the smallest moments, a shared cigarette, a whispered word of encouragement, the distant promise of dawn breaking over the horizon. It was about refusing to let the war claim the last pieces of your soul. Slowly, painfully, I began to understand that the war was not just a conflict raging outside me. It had burrowed inside, a relentless storm I would carry for the rest of my life. Yet within that storm flickered a fragile flame of resilience, a stubborn refusal to surrender completely. It was the part of me that still believed, despite the darkness and the loss, that someday, somehow, this nightmare might end, and I might find a way back to the man I used to be. The days stretched out like a bleak and endless desert themselves, each one bleeding into the next without distinction, blurring into a continuous haze of dust, heat, and exhaustion. Morning came not with relief but with the same merciless sun, beating down on our makeshift camp like an unyielding overseer. The wind swept through relentlessly, carrying fine grains of sand that found their way into every crevice, into my eyes, my mouth, my clothes, and my very soul. But what weighed heaviest was not the physical discomfort, it was the gnawing ache deep inside my chest that no amount of rest or prayer could soothe. The war was no longer a distant threat or a series of tactical maneuvers. It had burrowed inside me, a living, breathing shadow that tainted my every thought and haunted every moment of peace I tried to find. I had long ago realized that the battle raging in the desert was only the surface of the true war I fought, a brutal internal struggle against the darkness growing inside me. One afternoon, the sun hanging low in a sky smeared with the muted colors of approaching dusk, I sought refuge beneath the scant shade of a lone, gnarled tree, one of the few survivors in this harsh wasteland. The tree's twisted branches clawed at the sky, its leaves sparse but stubbornly green, and I found a strange kinship with it. We both struggled to endure in a place that seemed designed to break all living things. Around me, my fellow soldiers moved with the weary precision of men who had endured too much and seen too many friends fall. Their faces were etched deeply with fatigue, and yet beneath the lines of weariness, there was a flicker, an almost imperceptible glimmer of humanity that refused to be snuffed out. In small acts, sharing a tin of food, a quiet nod of encouragement, the briefest smile exchanged in a moment of fleeting respite, I witnessed the fragile threads that bound us, the invisible lifelines that held us together amidst the crushing weight of despair. Yet those moments of grace were ephemeral, like a fragile flame threatened by the relentless storm. The war's demands were unyielding, exacting a price far beyond what any man should bear. I felt the toll in the tremble of my hands during quiet moments, in the spiraling darkness that clouded my mind when I was alone. Questions consumed me, the purpose of this endless struggle, the meaning of sacrifice, and the fragile boundary between right and wrong. Those lines blurred and dissolved until I could no longer tell if my true enemy was the opposing force beyond our lines or the shadows that crawled within my own mind. One evening, after a day that felt as though the world itself had turned against us, marked by relentless ambushes, the cries of the wounded, and the hollow absence of fallen comrades, I found myself perched on a jagged rock, staring out at a barren horizon swallowed by the encroaching night. The sun dipped below the edge of the earth, casting elongated shadows that devoured the landscape, leaving everything cloaked in darkness. I pulled from my pocket a worn photograph of Anna, her smile radiant, a beacon of warmth and hope amidst this desolation. For a moment, the harshness of the desert faded, replaced by the tender memory of her face. My fingers traced the edges of the photo, and I whispered promises, vows to survive, to return, to be the man she believed I still was. But beneath those whispered words, a gnawing doubt took root. The man in that photograph was slipping further away with every grueling day spent in this hell. The war was reshaping me into someone I barely recognized, a stranger even to myself. The promise I made to her felt fragile, as if it could shatter with the slightest tremor of fear or despair. In those vulnerable moments, the weight of mortality pressed down on me with relentless force. Death was no longer a distant specter but a constant presence, lurking in every shadow and waiting patiently for the smallest slip, the briefest lapse in vigilance. I saw it reflected in the eyes of my comrades, the silent dread masked beneath stoic expressions, the unspoken fears we all shared, and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would come. We walked a razor's edge, balancing precariously between survival and oblivion. Yet, despite the overwhelming darkness, a stubborn spark endured. It was a glimmer of defiance, a refusal to surrender completely to despair. The war, as merciless as it was, had stripped away all pretense and forced me to confront the core of my being. The battle had become not just a fight for territory or ideology, but a desperate struggle for my own soul. Slowly, painfully, I came to understand that this war would never truly end, not as long as it burned inside me. The memories, the guilt, the loss, they were wounds that no passing of time or distance could heal. But within those wounds, buried deep beneath the scars, lay a strange resilience, a fierce determination to endure, to survive, and to seek meaning amidst chaos. Under the indifferent gaze of countless stars scattered across the desert night, I made a vow in the silence, a promise to fight not only against the enemies that lurked beyond our lines, but also against the darkness within myself. I knew this battle might never be fully won, but it was one I was resolved to wage as long as breath filled my lungs. And so, I carried on, wounded, weary, but unbroken, treading a path shadowed by loss yet lit faintly by the fragile hope that somewhere, beyond the horizon's edge, peace awaited. There came a day, in the long, grinding stretch of that war, when the veil of numbness I had wrapped myself in finally began to lift, not with a dramatic thunderclap, but like the slow, hesitant light of dawn breaking through a thick, unyielding fog. It was a day marked not by gunfire or explosions, but by a quiet moment of unexpected clarity, a glimpse of something beyond the endless cycle of violence and loss. I was sitting on a jagged outcrop overlooking the barren land, the sun high and unforgiving overhead, sweat mingling with dust on my skin. Around me, the camp was alive with its usual hum of restless energy, men preparing for the next mission, mechanics tuning engines, medics tending to the wounded. Yet inside me, something had shifted. In that stillness, I allowed myself to reflect, not just on the horrors I had witnessed, but on the fragile humanity still flickering within me and those around me. It was a dangerous thing to do in a place designed to strip away hope, but I clung to it like a lifeline. I thought of the men beside me, their laughter shared in brief respites, their whispered prayers in the dark, their acts of kindness that often went unnoticed by the world outside the camp. These small, sacred moments were the threads weaving a fragile tapestry of life amid the ruins. It was there, in the quiet endurance of ordinary humanity, that I found a sliver of meaning, a fragile light in the endless night. But that meaning was never pure or simple. The war stained everything, leaving scars not just on the land but deep within our souls. I recalled the faces of those lost, friends and strangers alike, each one a story cut brutally short. The mothers who would never hold their sons again, the children growing up without fathers, the communities shattered by violence. Their suffering was a shadow that stretched far beyond the battlefield, touching lives in ways I could never fully comprehend. I carried their pain with me, a heavy, invisible burden that pressed on my heart every moment I breathed. Even as despair threatened to swallow me whole, I sensed something else rising, a fierce resolve that would not be extinguished. It was not the naive hope of a boy who believed war was glorious, but a hardened, desperate determination to survive and bear witness. To survive not just physically, but mentally and spiritually. To hold on to the fragments of who I was before this nightmare, even if those fragments were shattered and worn thin. That resolve led me to moments of unexpected grace. I remember sitting with an old local man once, a quiet figure who had lived through countless cycles of violence and loss. His eyes, deep and knowing, held a sadness that mirrored my own. He spoke softly about the land, about the people who had fought and fallen, about the endless turning of seasons and the hope that somehow, peace might find a way to take root even here. His voice was weary but unwavering, and in that fragile hope, I found a reason to keep going, a balm for the wounds that festered within me. I also found strength in the bonds forged with my comrades, brothers not by blood, but by shared hardship and suffering. We carried each other through the darkest nights, lifted one another when despair threatened to crush us. In whispered conversations around campfires, in shared cigarettes passed hand to hand, in the silent understanding of eyes meeting across the chaos, we created a small sanctuary. It was imperfect and often fleeting, but it was ours. These bonds became a lifeline, a reminder that even in the midst of destruction, humanity endured. Still, the war exacted its toll in ways that no words could fully capture. I witnessed moments of unbearable cruelty, both inflicted and endured. The lines between right and wrong blurred until they seemed to vanish entirely, replaced by a harsh reality where survival often meant doing what was necessary, regardless of the cost. I carried the weight of choices made in split seconds, decisions that haunted me in the quiet hours. The faces of those I could not save, the screams that echoed long after silence returned, they became a part of me, etched into my very being. And yet, despite the scars, despite the loss and the pain, I began to understand a deeper truth, that war, for all its destruction, was not the end of the story. It was a chapter, brutal and unforgiving, but only a chapter. What came after, the possibility of peace, of healing, of rebuilding, was the real battle. It was a battle fought not with guns and bombs, but with courage, forgiveness, and the will to remember. In that quiet moment on the rocky outcrop, I realized that the war had changed me irrevocably, but it had not destroyed me. I was scarred, yes, but not broken. And with that realization came a fragile hope that someday, after all the bloodshed and loss, there might be an end to the war, not just in the world around me, but within myself. That hope was like a flickering candle in the vast darkness, enough to keep me moving forward, one uncertain step at a time, toward a future that I dared to believe could be different. As the sun dipped lower and painted the horizon with streaks of crimson and gold, I felt a rare peace settle over me, a momentary reprieve from the relentless storm. I looked out at the land I had fought so hard to survive in, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to dream of a life beyond the war, a life where the end of fighting meant the beginning of healing. The war, I came to understand with a slow-burning clarity forged in the harshest fires of battle, was never truly confined to the scarred and battered landscapes where we clashed with our enemies. No, its grasp extended far beyond the trenches, the blasted towns, and the shattered lives it visibly destroyed. It was a relentless conflict waged deep within the hearts and minds of those who survived, an internal battlefield far more brutal and unyielding than any outside attack. As the months dragged on and the years piled one upon the other like the heavy smoke that hung over the camps, I watched the faces around me change in ways that no uniform could hide. Some hardened like weathered stone, their features carved sharp with fatigue and loss. Others softened, cracks forming in the armor as grief and exhaustion gnawed at their resolve. And many, too many, simply broke, their spirits fractured beyond repair under the crushing weight of all we had endured. It was in those quiet, unguarded moments away from the weapons and noise, when the battlefields were replaced by silence, that the true, invisible cost of war revealed itself most cruelly. I saw it in the way a comrade's hand trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette, the faintest betrayal of the fear lurking beneath his stoic facade. I saw it in the haunted eyes of a friend who, when speaking of home, faltered and swallowed back the tears, fighting to hold himself together in the face of overwhelming loneliness. I saw it in the silent sobs stifled beneath the cover of night, the whispered prayers for strength whispered between exhausted breaths. We were soldiers, trained to fight, to kill, and to survive, but underneath the steel and the discipline, we were men desperately clinging to shards of our lost humanity. Some of us sought refuge in the routines imposed by military life, clinging to the smallest fragments of normalcy, a letter from home, the taste of canned food shared between comrades, a joke whispered just loud enough to crack the suffocating silence. Others retreated inward, locking away their pain behind walls of silence and indifference, carrying invisible wounds that no field medic could patch. I watched this toll unfold around me like a slow, unrelenting tide, and I knew that the war devoured more than flesh and bone. It consumed hope, faith, and the very belief in a future beyond the endless struggle for survival. One evening, beneath a sky so vast and indifferent that it seemed to swallow us whole, I found myself alone on a ridge overlooking the camp. The flickering firelight painted the faces of my brothers in arms with a soft glow, casting shadows that danced on their weary features as they slept or sat lost in thought. I pulled from my pocket the worn photograph of Anna, the one piece of home I still carried, a beacon of warmth and hope from a life that felt impossibly distant. I cradled it in my hands, whispering her name as if calling across an unbridgeable void might bring her closer, might tether me back to the man I once was before the war began to strip me away piece by piece. But the war was relentless, and it demanded sacrifices that could not be measured. I lost brothers in arms, men who had become family, friends who had shared my fears, my hopes, and my dreams. Their absence echoed in every hollow moment, a silence more deafening than any gunfire. I carried their memories like heavy stones in my pocket, each one unyielding and sharp, pressing down on my spirit with a weight I could never fully shed. Every loss was a fracture, deepening the cracks in my soul, making it harder to believe that anything good could survive this hell. Yet, even amid that overwhelming darkness, there were flickers of light, moments of grace that shone like stars against the black sky of despair. I remember one night vividly, when we huddled together around a meager campfire, the embers glowing softly as the world around us settled into a fragile quiet. We shared stories, not of battles and bloodshed, but of dreams long buried beneath the rubble, children we hoped to see grow into men and women, fields we longed to walk again, families waiting somewhere far away. We spoke of peace, of a time when guns would be silent and life would bloom anew from the ashes. Those moments, fragile and fleeting as they were, reminded us why we fought, why we endured. They were the threads that wove us back to hope. I began to understand, slowly and painfully, that the end of war was not a single triumphant moment but a long, arduous journey, a process of healing, forgiveness, and rebuilding that stretched far beyond the battlefield. It was about learning to forgive others and, perhaps even more painfully, forgiving ourselves. It was about carrying the scars of the past with grace, allowing them to teach us the preciousness of peace. The battle did not end when the guns fell silent. It continued in every difficult step taken toward mending shattered lives. In those reflections, I found a profound truth echoed in an ancient saying that had stayed with me through the darkest nights: only the dead have seen the end of war. Bitter though it was, it acknowledged the unending cycle of conflict that seemed woven into the fabric of humanity. But it was also a call to the living, to bear the memories of those lost with honor, to strive for peace even when the road ahead appeared impossible, and to carry forward the lessons learned in fire and blood. As I looked out over the desolate land, the wind carrying the faint, dusty scent of earth and smoke, a quiet resolve settled within me. The war had taken much. It had stolen friends, innocence, and countless dreams, but it had also granted a stark clarity about life, loss, and the enduring strength of hope. Though the scars, both visible and hidden, would remain forever etched upon my soul, I was determined to live in a way that honored those who had fallen. To be a testament that even in the darkest times, a sliver of light could find its way through. And so, with heavy steps and a heart both broken and unbowed, I continued forward, carrying the past with me, but refusing to be defined by it. Now, as I sit here years removed from those battle-scarred deserts, far from the echoes of gunfire and the acrid smoke that once filled the air, I find myself endlessly haunted by a question that has shadowed me through every quiet moment and restless night since the war began to fade into memory. Does war ever truly end? It is not a question born of naivete or simple curiosity, but of a deeply rooted struggle within a man who has been forged in the fires of conflict and forever marked by its flames. The faces of those I fought beside, and those I could not save, linger in my mind like ghosts who refuse to fade, their voice is a haunting chorus that rises with the wind and refuses to be silenced. I have stood amid the ruins left in the wake of war's devastation, walked through the hollow silence that follows the last echoes of battle, yet I know, with an aching certainty, that peace is a fragile, fleeting thing, often no more than a brief and precarious pause before the storm gathers once again. In these quiet hours of reflection, when the world is still and the ghosts grow loud, I return again and again to a bitter truth, one once whispered by sages and poets, a truth that once felt like a curse but has grown into a sober, unyielding reality. Only the dead have seen the end of war. Often attributed to Plato, but more likely penned by George Santayana, these words weigh heavy on my heart and mind, pressing down like an immovable stone. War is not merely a chapter in a history book, or a distant episode confined to far-off lands. It is a persistent, gnawing shadow that follows humanity through the ages, a cycle woven into the fabric of our existence that repeats endlessly in countless forms. It is not simply the clash of armies on fields or city streets. It is an ongoing struggle that plays out within societies, within communities, and ultimately within the hearts of individuals, within ourselves. I think back to the men I stood beside in those unforgiving days, their courage and fear intertwined, their laughter and tears held close beneath the weight of endless pressure. We fought not only against an enemy visible and armed, but against despair itself, the creeping, corrosive hopelessness that threatened to consume us from within. Many did not survive. Others carry wounds no surgeon's scalpel can touch, wounds hidden deep beneath flesh and bone, wounds of the soul and mind that time may dull but never fully heal. I carry those wounds with me still. Yet, in carrying them, I have come to realize that the fight does not end with the last bullet fired or the final ceasefire declared. The war's true battle continues long after the weapons fall silent, in the ongoing struggle to rebuild shattered lives, to find forgiveness where there is bitterness, and to discover meaning beyond the violence and loss. There were days, many of them, when I questioned the very purpose of it all, when the senseless carnage and relentless destruction seemed overwhelming, when the crushing weight of grief and survivor's guilt threatened to break me entirely. But even in those darkest hours, I witnessed moments of profound and stubborn humanity, a hand extended in kindness amid ruin, a shared meal passed quietly between weary souls, a whispered word of comfort in the suffocating silence of night. These small acts, fragile as they were, became my anchors in a sea of chaos and despair, reminders that even amid war's darkest depths, the human spirit endures. They taught me that resilience and hope could survive alongside sorrow and loss. War is a harsh teacher. It strips away illusions and comforts, forcing us to confront our deepest fears and confront the terrifying duality within ourselves, the capacity for both destruction and compassion, for cruelty and grace. I have witnessed the best and worst of humanity, often tangled together in the same moment. From the bitterest hatred to the simplest acts of love, war revealed the full spectrum of what it means to be human. And through it all, I came to believe that while war may never truly end, peace remains a pursuit worthy of our most fervent efforts, not with the thunder of guns and bombs, but with the quiet courage of understanding, empathy, and relentless hope. Now, as I speak these words, it is not with cynicism or despair, but with a hard-earned wisdom carved from years of suffering and survival. I carry the memories of that war like a shadow that stretches long and dark, sometimes painful, sometimes heavy, but always a reminder of what was lost and what is at stake. The cost of conflict is etched deeply into the lives of millions. The scars run not just across landscapes but through generations. Yet within that pain lies a call to action, a summons to honor those who fell, not merely through remembrance, but by striving to build a better world, by seeking peace with the same fierce determination we once fought with on the battlefield. The phrase, "only the dead have seen the end of war," is somber, yes, but it is also a rallying cry to the living, to those of us who carry the torch forward. We must bear witness to the past, learn from its bitter lessons, and strive tirelessly to break the endless cycle. War may be woven into the tapestry of human history, but it need not define our future. We have the power and the responsibility to imagine and create a world where the roar of guns is replaced by the quiet song of hope, where the wounds of war begin to heal rather than deepen. So when asked, does war ever truly end? I offer no simple answer, only a reflection born of experience. War only ends in death, but peace begins in the hearts of the living. And it is in those hearts that the true battle is fought. From the rubble and ruin, from the depths of despair, rises the fragile promise of peace. It is a promise that must be nurtured, protected, and fought for with every fiber of our being. Because if we do not, the cycle will continue, and generations yet unborn will face the same question and the same sorrow. I carry these truths with me every day, a weight and a guide. And as long as breath remains in my lungs, I will strive to honor the memories of those lost, not with hatred or vengeance, but with an unyielding commitment to peace. It is the greatest fight of all, and the one most worthy of our souls.